One ordinary morning, a billionaire's world shattered in an instant when a poor newspaper boy leapt into traffic to save his dog. What happened next would expose secrets, awaken buried humanity, and forever redefine the meaning of true wealth. The morning streets of the city were alive with their usual chaos, horns blaring, vendors shouting, the endless stream of cars weaving in and out as if in a choreographed frenzy. For most, it was simply another day, another race against time. But for one man inside the back seat of a black luxury car gliding through the crowd, the world outside had always been little more than background noise. Richard Collins, the billionaire chairman of one of the largest corporations in the country, sat in silence, his posture perfect, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of his phone. People often described him as unshakable, cold, calculating, a man whose heart was carved from marble. To him, the city was merely a machine, and he was the one who had mastered its gears. But fate, unpredictable and merciless, has a way of finding the tightest cracks in even the hardest stone, without warning. The car jolted slightly as the driver cursed under his breath. The back door had been nudged open, and a flash of golden fur leapt into the chaos. It was Max, Richard's beloved dog, the only living being that had ever managed to stay close to him without being crushed by the weight of his indifference. Richard's heart skipped in a way that frightened him, because for a man who had controlled billion-dollar deals with the flick of a pen, he now found himself utterly powerless. Max darted toward the rushing avenue, his paws scrambling on the concrete, his tail wagging obliviously as the growl of an oncoming truck bore down on him. Drivers slammed their brakes, pedestrians gasped, someone screamed, and in that moment, time fractured. Richard Collins, the man who had never begged for anything in his life, opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His world, for one terrifying heartbeat, collapsed into a single fragile thread, the fragile body of the dog who was about to be shattered by steel and rubber, and then, as if conjured by destiny, a blur broke through the crowd. A boy, skinny, ragged, clutching a stack of newspapers, threw himself into the street. His feet scraped against the asphalt, his knees slammed into the ground, but his arms wrapped around Max with desperate force. The truck screeched, tires burning, the smell of rubber and dust filling the air, stopping just inches away. For a moment, silence claimed the street. Even the relentless city seemed to hold its breath. The boy, no more than 12, winced at the pain clawing up his scraped arms, but he didn't let go. Instead, he smiled at the trembling dog pressed against his chest, whispering softly as if calming a frightened child, "You're safe now. I just didn't want you to get hurt." That single sentence, delivered with a broken voice yet anchored in pure sincerity, hit Richard Collins harder than any boardroom betrayal, harder than any hostile takeover. This was not gratitude or calculation. It was something he had long forgotten even existed. Selfless courage. The crowd erupted in murmurs. "That's Ethan Parker," a vendor whispered. "That boy sells newspapers here every morning, works from dawn till night. He quit school to help his family," another added. "I've seen him. Never complains, always smiling." Poor kid. Richard stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at the boy whose frail body bore the dust of the street, but whose eyes shone with a fire that no poverty could extinguish. In that gaze, Richard saw something terrifyingly familiar, reflection of himself as a child, before the world had taught him to value power over kindness, money over meaning. His throat tightened, but his pride kept him silent. Max whimpered and licked Ethan's cheek. The boy laughed, brushing the dog's ears gently. The sound was so innocent, so unguarded, that it cracked open something inside Richard's chest. For the first time in decades, the man who had everything felt the raw sting of shame, the haunting echo of a truth he could not yet name. The city roared back to life around them, horns honking, engines revving, footsteps rushing past. But for Richard Collins, nothing would ever again be the same. Because in that ordinary morning, amidst dust and chaos, a billionaire's world had been shaken to its core by a nameless boy who had nothing, and yet, in that moment, possessed everything that mattered. If this story has already made your heart race with curiosity, stay with us, because what unfolds after this shocking encounter will challenge everything you think you know about wealth, humanity, and redemption. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you powerful, life-changing stories like this one. Your support gives us the motivation to create more. Now, let me ask you a question, one that might reveal more about yourself than you expect. If you were standing on that crowded street, and saw a dog in mortal danger. Would you risk your own safety to save it, even if no one would ever know? Stay back, believing someone else would step in, because your own life comes first. Comment your answer below, or share with us what you truly believe. Your response might surprise you. Ethan's knees were still raw from the scrape against the unforgiving asphalt, but he brushed away the blood with the back of his hand as though it didn't matter. His face carried the marks of dust and sweat, yet when he looked down at Max, the trembling golden retriever licking his fingers, he smiled. It was not a forced grin meant to impress anyone, not the kind of hollow smile adults wear to disguise fear. It was pure, untainted joy, the quiet triumph of knowing he had done the right thing. I just didn't want him to get hurt, he murmured again, as if explaining himself to the frightened animal, not to the dozens of strangers who now surrounded him. Richard Collins stood nearby, the crowd parting instinctively around him, as though wealth itself demanded a radius of distance. For years he had cultivated a reputation of unshakable authority, a man incapable of sentiment. Yet now his polished shoes felt rooted to the ground. He could not pull his gaze away from the boy's battered figure, from that inexplicable light in his eyes. It was not pity he felt, he did not believe in pity, but something far more dangerous, recognition. The murmurs around him cut through the silence like whispers from a forgotten past. That boy's out here every morning, someone said. Sells papers till his voice is hoarse, just to bring home a few dollars. Another voice chimed in. His father's sick. His mother cleans houses. He should be in school. But life doesn't give him that choice. Each fragment of gossip was like a shard of glass pressing against Richard's carefully constructed armor, and then came the moment that unmoored him completely. Ethan turned his head, meeting Richard's eyes for the first time. There was no fear in the boy's expression, no deference to the man whose face often appeared on magazine covers and financial reports. Instead, there was only a quiet sincerity, the kind that strips away every mask. In that gaze, Richard saw something he had buried long ago. A flash of memory so sudden, so brutal rose before him. A small boy, barefoot and shivering, clutching a bundle of old textbooks under one arm. The boy's stomach growled with hunger, but his hands trembled with determination. That boy had been Richard himself, decades earlier, wandering the same kind of streets Ethan now called home. He remembered the ridicule, the dismissive looks from men in tailored suits who never saw him as anything more than a nuisance. And he remembered the single teacher who had noticed, who had extended a hand when everyone else turned away. Without that hand, without that sliver of belief, Richard knew he would never have climbed out of poverty's shadows. Now here he was, decades and billions later, staring at a boy who might as well have been his mirror. Max wagged his tail, oblivious to the storm raging inside his owner's chest. Ethan scratched the dog's ears, laughing softly despite the sting of his wounds. The sound was startling in its innocence, and Richard felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Shame. It struck him with a force greater than any corporate rival had ever managed. The people on the street began to disperse, but Richard remained, caught in a moment he couldn't rationalize. For so long, he had defined strength as control over markets, over people, over every variable life presented. But here was a boy who had nothing, no wealth, no status, no armor of influence. And yet Ethan had done what Richard, with all his power, had been unable to do. He had acted without hesitation, driven by something no money could buy. It would have been easy to dismiss the scene, to retreat into his car and bury the memory beneath the avalanche of meetings and contracts that awaited him. But he couldn't. The image of Ethan's smile, blood streaking down his shin, cradling a dog he didn't own, had carved itself into his mind. Richard realized with a kind of dread that the boy had not only saved Max's life, he had exposed the hollowness of Richard's own. Reporters later would describe this as the first visible crack in the billionaire's icy facade. But in that moment, there were no cameras, no headlines, no carefully orchestrated narratives. There was only a man who suddenly felt the weight of all the choices he had made, the walls he had built around himself, and the humanity he had traded away for empire. Ethan rose slowly, wincing as he shifted his weight to his bruised leg. He handed Max's leash back to the driver without ceremony, as though returning a borrowed item. Then he bent down to gather the newspapers scattered across the pavement, dusting them off with the same care he had shown the animal. Each folded sheet bore smudges of ink, headlines of stories that would be forgotten by tomorrow. Yet in that instant, Richard knew that none of those words mattered compared to the unspoken lesson standing before him. It was not about the dog. It was not even about gratitude. It was about something Richard had long ago abandoned, the simple courage to care. As Ethan turned to walk away, blending back into the faceless crowd of the city, Richard felt his chest tighten. The man who once believed he was untouchable had been undone by a child who asked for nothing. And though he did not yet know it, that fleeting exchange on a busy morning street would ignite a transformation that would ripple far beyond the life of one billionaire and one boy, because sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not in boardrooms or palaces, but in the quiet conviction of a child who refuses to let something or someone be harmed. And for Richard Collins, that conviction was about to change everything. That night, long after the city's chaos had melted into a restless quiet, Richard Collins sat alone in his penthouse office. The skyline stretched before him, glass towers gleaming like monuments to his triumphs, yet he could not bring himself to admire them. His mind kept circling back to the boy, dust on his cheeks, blood on his knees, and that smile that refused to vanish even in pain. Richard prided himself on being a man of logic, a man who never surrendered to emotion. But logic could not silence the image of Ethan Parker holding Max with such fierce tenderness. He poured himself a drink, though the whiskey burned harsher than usual. In business, when faced with an unknown variable, Richard always investigated. Tonight was no different. With a curt order to his assistant, he demanded every detail on the boy. He wanted facts, something concrete, something he could measure and categorize. But when the report arrived, it delivered something he was unprepared for. The truth. Ethan Parker was 12 years old. His teachers once called him gifted, the kind of student who solved math problems in minutes and devoured books beyond his grade level. His report cards were a parade of excellence, until the year his father fell gravely ill and could no longer work. His mother, struggling to hold the family together, took on cleaning jobs, but the money barely covered rent and medicine. School became a luxury they could no longer afford. Ethan quit not because he wanted to, but because survival demanded it. Richard's fingers tightened around the report as he read that Ethan now woke before sunrise, hauling stacks of newspapers heavier than his thin frame down crowded blocks. He sold each copy with a polite nod, saving every cent, yet even in the margins of those long days, he never abandoned his hunger for learning. Tucked inside his satchel, hidden among folded papers, investigators found worn notebooks filled with neatly copied lessons. The boy would crouch in alleyways or sit on stoops, scribbling down equations or passages from borrowed textbooks whenever business slowed. He studied by streetlight when nights stretched too long. He carried knowledge as if it were treasure, though no one paid him for it. Richard leaned back, the words blurring as a memory surged unbidden. He saw himself as a boy, just as hungry for knowledge, clutching used books rescued from trash bins, reciting passages in whispers to drown the gnawing in his stomach. He remembered how the world had looked at him then with disdain, with dismissal, until one man, a teacher who saw more than rags, had placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You belong in a classroom, not on these streets." That hand had pushed open a door Richard never could have forced himself. Without it, the empire he now commanded would never have existed. Now, staring at Ethan's story, he felt a rare sensation he despised: helplessness. He could buy anything, sway governments, alter markets. Yet he had almost allowed this boy, so much like himself, to slip back into the shadows where brilliance is extinguished. The next morning, restless and unwilling to wait, Richard went himself to the Parker residence. His car pulled into a neighborhood far from the polished avenues he called home. The air smelled of damp concrete and faint smoke. The building leaned as if exhaustion pressed against its bones. Through a cracked door, Richard glimpsed a world that the wealthy never see. The walls were peeling, the floor worn thin. A frail man lay on a cot, coughing softly, a bowl of untouched soup at his side. A woman, shoulders bent from endless labor, wrung laundry by hand in a bucket, her movements weary but precise. And there, in the corner near a flickering lamp, Ethan sat cross-legged with a battered textbook propped on his knees, lips moving silently as he memorized a passage. Richard did not announce himself. He watched, hidden in shadow, as the boy scribbled answers into a notebook so filled with eraser marks that the paper had thinned to near transparency. He watched how Ethan occasionally glanced at his father with worrying, then forced himself back to the page with stubborn resolve. This was not just a child's pastime. It was survival of a different kind. Learning was his rebellion against despair. Something inside Richard shifted again, more violently than before. Because in that dimly lit room, he saw not only the boy, but his own reflection, the boy he used to be. And the man he could have become if not for one hand extended in compassion. He returned to his car in silence, but silence now carried weight. For the first time in years, Richard admitted to himself that he had forgotten the very foundation of his own rise. He had mistaken fortune as self-made, when in truth it had been a gift he had never repaid. And now destiny, in the form of a ragged newspaper boy, was reminding him. When the driver asked where to next, Richard gave no immediate answer. His voice, when it finally came, was quieter than usual, stripped of authority, yet lined with something rarer: vulnerability. "Find out what it would take," he said, staring at the cracked tenement building as though it were a mirror. Not just for him, for others like him. The city roared beyond, indifferent as ever, but Richard's world had tilted. The empire he had built suddenly seemed less important than the fragile notebook of a boy who dreamed by lamplight. And though Richard did not yet know how, he understood one thing with absolute clarity: he could not walk away unchanged. Ethan Parker's struggle had reopened a chapter of his own life that he had long sealed shut. And the man who once measured everything in profits was beginning to ask himself a question he had never dared before. What is the worth of a life if it is spent ignoring the lives of those who remind us of who we once were? When Richard Collins returned to that corner where Ethan Parker worked each morning, the boy was once again standing with a bundle of newspapers in his arms, his voice carrying above the traffic as he called out headlines no one truly stopped to hear. To most, he was invisible, a shadow moving through the noise of the city. But to Richard, who had spent sleepless nights with the boy's story echoing in his mind, Ethan had become something impossible to ignore. The black sedan pulled up to the curb, gleaming against the dull grey of the street. People turned their heads. They recognized the vehicle as something belonging to a man far removed from their world. Richard stepped out, impeccably dressed as always, but there was no cold detachment in his posture this time. His eyes searched the crowd until they found the boy who had unknowingly shaken the walls of his heart. Ethan noticed the man approaching, but instead of awe or fear, there was only mild confusion. The boy lowered the stack of papers. "You again?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying both curiosity and caution. Richard stood before him, and for the first time in years he hesitated. Words did not come easily to a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms, but this was no boardroom. This was a test of something deeper, something far more human. "You saved my dog," Richard said finally, his voice quieter than he expected. "I never thanked you," Ethan shrugged, shifting the weight of the newspapers. "I didn't do it for thanks. I just didn't want him to be hurt." His words were simple, almost casual, but they struck Richard like an indictment. How often had he himself done something without expectation of reward? He could not recall. For a long moment, they stood in the thick rhythm of the city's morning rush. Finally, Richard asked, "Why do you do this every day? Why aren't you in school?" The boy's gaze dropped for a moment, his fingers tightening on the edges of the papers. "Someone has to help at home. My dad's sick, and my mom. She works all day. We need the money." He spoke without bitterness, as if stating an unchangeable fact. Then he lifted his head, and in his eyes Richard saw the stubborn flame of dignity. "I don't mind working, but what I really want is to go back to school. I don't need much." Just that. It was such a small request, so plain that anyone else might have missed its weight. But for Richard, it carried the force of revelation. The boy wasn't asking for charity, nor for rescue. He wasn't begging for wealth, or for someone to erase the struggles of his life. All he wanted was the chance to learn, the chance Richard himself had once been given by another's kindness. Richard felt his throat tighten, a pressure he was not used to enduring. He remembered the years of his own hunger, the nights when he whispered formulas under the dim glow of a single lamp, the shame of being looked at as though he were less than human. And he remembered the one voice that had told him otherwise, the teacher who had said, "You deserve more than this." Looking at Ethan now, Richard realized that wealth had blinded him. He had built towers of steel and glass, measured life in assets and numbers, but here in front of him stood a truth that dismantled all of it. Wealth was not power. Wealth was the ability to give someone else a future. You should be in a classroom, Richard said, his voice firm now, carrying the weight of conviction. Not out here shouting into traffic. Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile, but it wasn't mocking. It was filled with something closer to hope. That would be nice, he replied softly. But life doesn't always give you what you want. Sometimes you just take what's left and make it work. Those words pierced deeper than any negotiation Richard had ever lost. This child, with nothing in his pockets but coins and ink-stained paper, spoke with a wisdom that silenced him. He realized that the boy had already learned the lesson Richard had resisted for years, that dignity and courage matter more than possession. A car horn blared in the distance, pulling Richard back into the moment. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card. "Come to this address tomorrow," he said, extending it to Ethan. The boy looked at it suspiciously. "Why?" Richard held his gaze, unflinching. "Because I want to talk about your future. And because I owe you more than I can ever repay." For a moment, Ethan seemed torn. He glanced down at the newspapers in his arms, then back at the man before him. Finally, with the same quiet resolve he had shown in the street when saving Max, he took the card and slipped it into his pocket. "I'll think about it," he said simply. Richard nodded. It wasn't a promise, but it was enough. As he turned to leave, he knew this encounter had already shifted something irreversible. A boy's simple words had peeled back layers of indifference that years of power had hardened in him. Back in the car, as the city blurred past the windows, Richard felt a strange clarity settle over him. He understood now what his fortune was truly worth, and it had nothing to do with profit margins or shareholder approval. It was worth exactly as much as the futures it could build. And in that realization, Richard Collins, a man who once measured his life in towers of steel and glass, felt something stir within him that he hadn't felt since childhood. Not power, not triumph, but purpose. The grand hall was packed with reporters, philanthropists, and business leaders, all waiting for Richard Collins to speak. The invitation had been vague, mentioning only a special announcement. Whispers filled the room, speculation about a new acquisition, a merger, perhaps another empire-defining move. For decades, Richard's name had been synonymous with ruthless expansion. He was expected to unveil another triumph, not to bare his soul. Yet when he stepped onto the stage, something about him was different. His shoulders were less rigid, his eyes carried a gravity no headline could capture. Beside him, quietly clutching a stack of papers as though it were an extension of himself, stood Ethan Parker. The boy shifted nervously under the glare of cameras, but Richard placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, a gesture so uncharacteristic that it hushed the murmurs in an instant. The billionaire, known for his unyielding presence, had just revealed the first crack of tenderness. He began not with statistics or corporate forecasts, but with a story. "A few weeks ago," he said, his voice deliberate and steady, "I watched my dog nearly die on a busy street. And I watched a boy I had never met throw himself into danger to save him. That boy stands beside me today." He gestured toward Ethan, who lowered his eyes, embarrassed by the sudden attention. "At first, I thought it was just an act of bravery, but I was wrong. It was something more. It was a lesson." The room stilled, cameras clicking softly. Richard had never admitted to learning anything from anyone but himself. Now he continued, his words weighted with vulnerability. "I discovered that this boy Ethan Parker has been forced to sacrifice his education to provide for his family. Yet even while selling newspapers in the cold, he carries textbooks in his bag, refusing to let poverty strip him of knowledge. I recognized something in him that I had forgotten about myself. I saw the boy I used to be before I built all of this." He swept a hand toward the towering image of the Collins empire projected behind him. "I saw the child who once needed someone to believe in him." A murmur spread through the audience. Some were visibly moved, others remained skeptical. Richard had built his legacy on iron walls of control. Could this be real? He pressed forward, his voice gaining strength. "I have built skyscrapers, corporations, and fortunes, but none of that carries meaning if I ignore the faces of children like Ethan. Wealth is not measured by the towers you own or the markets you command. It is measured by the futures you enable." He paused, and the silence in the hall thickened with anticipation. "That is why, today, I am establishing the Max Scholarship Fund, named after the dog whose near death showed me what truly matters. This fund will provide education to hundreds of children across the country who are forced to choose survival over learning. No child should have to give up school to sell papers or clean streets. No brilliance should be wasted simply because it was born in poverty. Applause broke out, tentative at first, then swelling as the weight of his words settled. But Richard raised his hand, quieting the crowd. "Let me be clear," he said, eyes sweeping across the room. "This is not charity. It is justice. It is a recognition that talent and potential do not belong only to the privileged. It belongs to every child who dares to dream." Ethan looked up at him, his young face a mixture of awe and disbelief. The boy had expected perhaps a thank you, maybe a reward, but not this tidal wave of opportunity. Richard noticed the trembling in Ethan's hands, the way he tried to steady his breathing. And in that fragile gesture, he saw the enormity of what this moment meant. "Ethan Parker," Richard announced, "will be the first recipient of the Max Scholarship. His education will be fully funded from this day forward. And his story will serve as a reminder that courage can be found in the most unexpected places." The cameras erupted, flashes scattering across the room like lightning. Reporters shouted questions, but Richard was not finished. He leaned closer to the microphones, his tone lowering to something more intimate. "I want to say one more thing. When Ethan saved my dog, he did not only save a life. He saved a part of me I thought was lost forever. He reminded me that humanity is not a weakness. It is our greatest strength." His voice broke slightly on the last word, a crack so rare from a man of his stature that it landed with thunderous force. Applause thundered, this time unrestrained. Some stood, clapping until their palms stung. Yet Richard did not bask in it. Instead, he turned to Ethan, who was blinking rapidly against the flashes of cameras. "You once told me you didn't need much," Richard said softly, though the microphones carried every syllable. "You just wanted to learn. Today, you will. And tomorrow, hundreds like you will too. That is my promise." The boy nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek. It was not the tear of a child overwhelmed by sudden attention, but of someone who had carried a burden too heavy for his age and finally felt it begin to lift. Richard placed an arm lightly around his shoulders, and for the first time in years, the billionaire felt lighter to dot in the days that followed. The world would debate his motives. Was this redemption, publicity, or genuine transformation? Richard did not care. He knew the truth. He knew that for once, his wealth had been used not to build walls but to open doors. And standing beside Ethan, he realized something he had never said before, not even to himself, that the greatest return on investment is found not in profit, but in people. The press conference ended, but its echo lingered. For some, it was the story of a billionaire's unexpected generosity. For others, it was proof that even the most unyielding hearts can change. But for Richard Collins, it was simply the beginning of a new legacy, one written not in skyscrapers, but in the lives of children whose futures would no longer be stolen by circumstance. And as he left the stage, with Ethan walking beside him, Richard allowed himself one final thought. True wealth is not the empire you leave behind. It is the hope you pass forward. Richard Collins's story with Ethan Parker is more than just the tale of a billionaire and a boy who sold newspapers. It is a reminder of how fragile, yet powerful, the human heart can be when confronted with innocence and courage. At first, Richard was a man armored by success, defined by skyscrapers and fortunes, measured only by numbers. Yet a single act of bravery, performed by a child with nothing but determination, broke through that armor. Ethan risked himself not for recognition, not for reward, but simply because he could not bear to see another creature suffer. In that moment, Richard rediscovered something he had buried, the truth that wealth without compassion is emptiness, and that the greatest victories are not found in boardrooms, but in the lives we touch. As Richard uncovered Ethan's story, his sacrifices, his hidden hunger for education, his relentless pursuit of knowledge despite poverty, he saw a reflection of his own forgotten beginnings. That recognition became the spark for change. And when Richard chose to act, he did not just give Ethan a chance to return to school. He created a legacy that would ripple outward, a fund that would touch the lives of countless children, proving that one boy's courage could reshape the vision of a man who once thought himself beyond change. The lesson here is profound. Greatness is not measured by how high we climb, but by how many we lift along the way. Each of us, regardless of our status, has the power to be the hand that opens a door for someone else. Compassion may begin with small gestures offering time, attention, or encouragement, but these acts can create transformations larger than we imagine. In today's world, where ambition often overshadows empathy, Richard's transformation reminds us that the future depends on whether we choose to give others the same chances that once shaped us. So, what can you take from this story into your own life? Look around. There may be an Ethan near you, a child, a friend, a colleague, someone with untapped potential, silently waiting for belief, encouragement, or support. You don't need billions to change a life. Sometimes all it takes is noticing, reaching out, and giving someone the chance to rise. When you do, you may find, just like Richard, that in saving someone else's future, you end up saving your own humanity. Now let me ask you a simple question. If you had the chance to support one child's education today, would you do it? Comment your answer below, yes or no, and share your perspective so others can reflect with you. And if this story has touched you, please subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the motivation to continue creating meaningful content that inspires change and reminds us all of the power of compassion.